Well, howdy, and welcome to Conversations with Coyotes. My name is Bravado, I am a coyote, and this is Real Gamer Hours. First video game that made me realize that I really liked video games was Super Mario Bros. On the original Nintendo. I don't really remember my experience with games before that. I know they weren't entirely foreign to me, but I wasn't excited about them either. Despite that, it was years before I actually got a Nintendo of my own, and only after I'd already had a Game Boy for a while, trying desperately to find portable games that could similarly capture the magic of some of the NES games I loved so much. This would be a theme for several generations. Some set of circumstances would result in me getting a console and then pining for the experiences on the competition, whether that was searching for analogs to Nintendo staples when I had a Genesis and later a PlayStation, or trying to find a good GTA clone when I had a GameCube. Of course, during this time, I also became an adult and suddenly had my own money to spend, so it was only a matter of time before I simply filled those gaps myself. But the decision about which console to buy first from any generation is rarely a simple one, and that's why I usually don't buy any of them right away. Until now. I wasn't really caught up in the hype leading up to these latest console releases, but as I noticed that resale on the current generation was reasonably strong and I could get a head start on my next-gen console experience without being terribly out of pocket, I changed my mind. Also, Cyberpunk 2077 was coming out and I wanted to be prepared. You know, I'll admit to having jumped on the Cyberpunk bandwagon a bit later than most, but I was still looking forward to it. I loved the concept, and I was excited to explore Night City, especially on new hardware that could properly handle it. I say was because the game has been laden with baggage for some time now. Talk a major development crunch was bad enough, but then they went out of their way to tokenize trans folks in their advertising despite making no real apparent effort to understand them. The studio's responses to such issues have been pretty disappointing, and somehow the game seems to be bringing out the worst of the fans as well. There's an astounding amount of vitriol toward anyone who takes issue with this game, and it's really disheartening. I thought I'd seen the worst of it with transphobic adjacent comments about how developers couldn't be expected to program a game that caters to every possible gender identity, but then reports came out about a sequence that could potentially cause seizures, and the ableist comments really managed to drag the discourse down to a new depth. It was at this point I decided to close Twitter for a while and maybe look for some different games to play. Heck, the real next-gen version of the game doesn't even come out until next year, so I'm in no rush. So I bought a Series X. It replaced my Xbox One X, which replaced an original Xbox One, which succeeded a quantity of Xbox 360s that I frankly cannot quite keep track of. Where did they all even come from? I don't know. I had an original Xbox 2 near the end of that generation, but the 360 was what hooked me. To say it was like the jump from classic Mac OS to OS X would be to date myself even more than usual, but it was revolutionary for me personally, for Microsoft, and for console gaming as a whole. Everything about the original Xbox felt like it was intended specifically for hardcore gamers with a Z, versus the utilitarian PS2 or the friendlier GameCube. But the hardware design, and more importantly the operating system on the 360 made it seem so much more approachable. In a lot of ways, the 360 was the beginning of the things we take for granted in a modern console, and it introduced those in a pretty graceful way. And while Microsoft stumbled with the launch of the Xbox One in 2013, the momentum of the previous generation was enough for me to pick one up the following year so I could check out some of the newer games. I upgraded again to a One X to get that sweet 4K, and now, finally, the Series X. All this to say that Xbox has become my default, by way of consistently being closer to my general sensibilities than the other options. You might feel differently, and there's nothing wrong with that. Now more than ever, the question of which console to buy is more analogous to choosing a phone or computer in that it's less about which specific piece of hardware is the best, and more about which one will best deliver the ecosystem that you prefer. In a lot of ways, upgrading from an Xbox One to a Series X is really not much different from upgrading to a new phone. Under the skin, it's way more capable, and you're continually reminded of that when you see how much better it is at handling tasks that the older model might have struggled with, but it's still an Xbox. Even the setup process is taking cues from other smart devices. On first launch, it prompts you to connect to the Xbox app on your phone, so if you've used that with your previous console, it can inherit all of those settings. It's so seamless that I didn't even have to run new cables, I just plugged the old ones into the new box, and the old external hard drives, and synced my first gen Elite controller. Everything just works, and I've never had this experience with a console before. And yes, I know that Series X games need to live on the internal storage, but if you're playing an older game and don't necessarily care about the performance improvements, you can still run it right off the external disk. Or at least keep stuff there when you're not actively using it to save space on the internal drive. But when I say everything just works, I mean everything. The rechargeable battery packs from the Xbox One controllers work perfectly in the new ones as well. The only difference is that the new ones charge via USB-C instead of micro USB. More importantly, the Xbox One Rock Band guitar syncs right up, and even the adapter that lets you use the older wireless peripherals works. The long and short of it is, the new Xboxes do everything the Xbox One did, but faster and better, and you can confidently replace your old Xbox with this new one and reap only benefits. Well, almost everything. If you loved your Kinect or the HDMI input on the old consoles, you'll be sad to hear the new ones don't have them, and you may want to keep yours around. I didn't, so I didn't. But what are we supposed to call it? As a standalone, Series X is kind of a cool name, but that's only half of this generation. Is it the Series SX? That doesn't sound right. Is it just Series or Xbox Series? Both of those sound really vague. Don't get me wrong, Xbox One wasn't a good name either, but it was far enough removed from the Xbox lowercase one that there wasn't really much confusion. What if Microsoft steps in after all this to tell us it's actually the Roman numeral X and this is actually the Series 10? This keeps getting worse and worse. Regardless, the name is not great. I feel like Microsoft should be thinking about a naming convention that can be extended to future generations, and I don't know how that works here. But the real hurdle facing the new Xboxes, for now at least, is that they're subtle, particularly when compared to the PS5. They're a big improvement, to be sure, but also a logical evolution. Microsoft's choice to iterate on the brutalist design aesthetic from the later Xbox's One further reflects this, given the sense that these are devices that are the latest in an ongoing series. Oh. Yeah, that makes sense. On the other hand, to look at the PS5 is to expect a brand new experience. Maybe that experience is pretending it's a tiny futuristic skyscraper and stomping around next to it like you're a kaiju. Who am I to judge? It's a temporary issue though. The Series S in particular will flourish once the audience for these new consoles expands to more than just early adopters, and the Series X will be there for anyone who wants the peak Xbox experience. The Apex box, if you will. Huh? Huh? Oh. So what we've learned is that if you like the Xbox, the Series X is a really good Xbox. If you don't like the Xbox, the Series X is still a really good Xbox. And while platform exclusives will compel me to pick up a PS5 at some point, now is not the time. I mean, have you seen it? Anyway, this will likely be my penultimate video for this year, and I think I'd like to wrap up 2020 with one more Q&A. So if you'd like to ask a question, use the form in the description or leave a comment below. Thanks for watching, stay safe, and I'll catch y'all later.